You hear the sound before you see them, the low hum of voices rising over the crash of waves, the deep, rhythmic chant of men whose eyes have long forgotten mercy. And as the morning fog rolls off the gray North Sea, the carved dragon head of a longship cuts through the mist like a living thing. It is the year 920 CE, the age of the Vikings. But this is not the image the modern world remembers, not just warriors in horned helmets or heroes from sagas. This was an age of strange faiths, of ritual and sacrifice, of gods that demanded more than devotion. They demanded surrender, of flesh, of will, and sometimes of the soul itself. The ship grinds against the wet sand of the English coast. The raiders step off, heavy boots sinking into the mud. They are not ordinary men. They are bound by oaths, their bodies painted with symbols of protection and desire, their eyes reflecting both reverence and fear. What they carry in their hearts is older than any written word, a belief that pleasure and power were intertwined with blood and fate. For centuries, the Christian chroniclers of Europe whispered about Viking rituals too unholy to record in detail, ceremonies where desire was transformed into offering, and the boundaries between the sacred and the profane blurred beyond recognition. To outsiders, these were acts of savagery, but to the Vikings, they were acts of worship, the binding of life to the gods through the primal forces that gave it meaning. History remembers the Vikings for their raids, but what the raids concealed were deeper rituals, performed not for greed, but for balance, a belief that the gods of fertility and war demanded equal devotion, that no feast of victory was complete without appeasing the unseen powers that ruled over both creation and destruction. In the cold northern nights, under the endless shimmer of the aurora, Viking clans gathered in sacred groves, the air thick with smoke and chanting. They performed rites that merged the cycles of the earth with those of the human spirit. To them, every act, even those that would make modern minds shudder, was an offering to keep the world from falling into chaos. But where did this belief come from? What drove an entire civilization to blur the line between the divine and the forbidden? Archaeologists who unearthed the remains of temples in Gamla Uppsala and Skedemose found altars stained with traces of burnt offerings, and beside them carved idols of both male and female gods, symbols of creation and fertility standing side by side. These were not merely places of worship, but of transformation. The Vikings believed that the energy of life flowed strongest when the boundaries between strength and surrender dissolved. In these ceremonies, men and women alike were seen as conduits of divine power, their unions, symbolic acts, meant to sustain the favor of the gods. But not all rituals were serene or joyous. Some were shrouded in secrecy, performed under moonlight, far from the eyes of the uninitiated. It was said that during the festival of Yule, the deep winter celebration, the barriers between the human world and the spirit realm grew thin. To ensure fertility and protection for the coming year, offerings were made to the goddess Freya, not of blood, but of devotion embodied through symbolic acts of passion. The rituals, described only in fragments by foreign observers, carried undertones of both reverence and fear. To a Viking, the act of giving oneself, whether in battle or in ritual, was a form of submission to destiny. It was said that through such offerings, one could momentarily touch the divine. Yet, beneath this faith, lay something darker, the belief that every blessing demanded a cost, for every birth, a death, for every pleasure, a pain. One 10th century Arab traveler, Ahmad ibn Fadlan, once witnessed a Viking funeral on the banks of the Volga River. His writings, though colored by his own culture's shock, describe scenes of intense ritual preparation, purification, chanting, and symbolic unions meant to guide the deceased into the afterlife. It was not cruelty he saw, but conviction, a people utterly devoted to the idea that life itself was an offering to powers beyond comprehension. But imagine what it must have felt like to stand among them, the cold wind biting your skin, the chants rising until the air trembles, the faces illuminated by torchlight, their expressions a blend of ecstasy and terror. You would realize, perhaps, that this was not about indulgence. It was about balance, about touching something so ancient and sacred that it defied morality altogether. The gods of the north were not kind gods. Odin, who traded his eye for wisdom, Thor, who conquered with force, and Freya, goddess of love, fertility, and death, who ruled over both passion and the battlefield. To honor her, the Vikings celebrated desire as a divine force, not shameful, but essential. Yet their reverence was never tender. It was fierce, unyielding, and edged with danger. In the sacred groves of Uppsala, surrounded by ancient oak trees, rituals were said to last for days, the air filled with song, laughter, and trance like chanting. The participants believed they were entering communion with the gods themselves. But as with all faith, the line between worship and obsession was thin. The deeper one went into these mysteries, the closer one came to losing the self, to dissolving into the will of the divine. It is this paradox that terrified the Christian chroniclers who first encountered the Vikings. They could not comprehend a society that saw the act of creation, the essence of life, as both sacred and dangerous. To them, these rites were evidence of barbarity. To the Vikings, they were the heartbeat of the world. Even in death, these beliefs endured. Archaeological discoveries reveal graves adorned with symbols of fertility and transformation, tiny figurines of lovers, intertwined serpents, and carved pendants bearing Freya's likeness. In one burial mound, the remains of a woman were found with a necklace depicting Thor's hammer alongside the Christian cross, a sign that even as the North converted, the old faiths refused to die quietly. As Christianity spread through Scandinavia, these rituals were pushed into secrecy, but they did not vanish. Instead, they changed, blending into folklore, into whispered stories of witches who danced beneath the full moon, of farm wives who left offerings at old stones for blessings of fertility, of men who still swore oaths to Odin when storms raged at sea. History may forget what these ceremonies truly looked like, but the fear they inspired, that primal unease that comes when devotion becomes indistinguishable from desire, still lingers in the collective memory of the North. And perhaps that is what makes them so haunting, not the acts themselves, but what they reveal about humanity, this endless hunger to connect with something greater, even when it means crossing into the forbidden. These were not rituals of cruelty, as the old priests claimed. They were attempts to touch eternity. But the question remains, what happens when human devotion pushes too far? As the longship fades into the mist, its warriors chanting in tongues older than scripture, you are left with the uneasy realization that the darkness they carried was not born of evil, but of belief, and that belief, once awakened, never truly dies. Soft pause, voice lowers. Before we continue deeper into the hidden rituals that even Viking elders feared to speak aloud, the ones buried in the frost of Scandinavian graves, take a moment. If stories like this make you question what you thought you knew about history, subscribe, because in the chapters ahead, we will uncover truths that most textbooks refuse to touch. The next part of this story leads us where even Viking scholars hesitate to go, into the shadows of the sacred groves, where human and divine desire intertwined in rituals so intense, their echoes still haunt the north. What began as devotion would soon become obsession, and when the gods stopped answering, the Vikings found new ways to make them listen. The snow falls quietly on the temple hill of Gamla Uppsala. The once sacred grove stands still, the oaks heavy with frost, the ground beneath them hardened like old bone. It is the 11th century now, and the north is changing. Wooden crosses rise where stone idols once stood. The priests of Christ have come, carrying not swords, but scripture. And yet, to the people of the north, their words cut just as deep. The old gods, they say, are dead. But deep beneath the frozen soil, something ancient still stirs. To understand the final chapter of these disturbing rituals, we must look not at war, but at silence, the silence of a civilization being transformed. When Christianity took hold of Scandinavia, it did not happen through conquest alone. It happened through fear, through persuasion, and through the slow rewriting of stories. The rites that once defined Viking faith, ceremonies celebrating the cycle of life, fertility, and divine union, were recast as sins. The sacred dances became forbidden. The songs of Freya were replaced by hymns. The women who once served as Valur, spiritual priestesses who could command kings, were branded witches and cast into the snow. Yet, the old rituals did not vanish overnight. They went underground, in isolated villages, hidden between fjords and forests. People still whispered the ancient names during the winter solstice. Farmers still poured ale onto the earth before sowing their crops, whispering prayers to the lady below, never daring to call her Freya aloud. The transformation of faith was not total. It was a slow fading, like a candle burning to its final ember. But what truly frightened the Christian chroniclers was not the persistence of paganism, it was its intimacy. Unlike the distant God of the church, the old gods of the north lived close, in the earth, in the sea, in the breath between two people. Their rituals celebrated the body as a sacred vessel of life. To the priests, this was blasphemy, but to the Vikings, it was gratitude, a recognition that every birth, every harvest, every embrace was a miracle carved from the frost. As centuries passed, these forbidden practices became ghost stories. Villagers spoke of the midsummer dance, where lights moved in the forest and laughter echoed through the trees, though no one could be seen. Some claimed these were the spirits of those who refused to abandon the old ways, dancing still in defiance of time. Others said they were the gods themselves, waiting to be remembered. Archaeological evidence supports these whispers. Beneath Christian churches, built during the 11th and 12th centuries, archaeologists have uncovered pagan artifacts, amulets of Freya, miniature idols of Thor, fertility symbols buried beneath altars. It was as if the builders themselves feared to anger the old gods, choosing to conceal rather than destroy their legacy. And then there are the carvings. In hidden corners of medieval stave churches across Norway, intricate designs twist through the wood, serpents, vines, and intertwined figures that no priest could explain. Officially, they represent biblical themes, but their style tells another story, the language of the old rituals, encoded in wood, disguised as ornament. Imagine walking through one of those churches today, the scent of pine and smoke, the flicker of candlelight against ancient carvings. You can almost hear the echo of the old chants, the heartbeat of a people who refused to forget. What made these rituals so disturbing to outsiders was never their acts, but their meaning. To the Vikings, the union between man and woman, between life and death, between mortal and divine, was sacred balance. Modern historians now believe that these rites were symbolic, not carnal, dramatic reenactments of mythic cycles meant to renew harmony with nature. But in a time when fear ruled faith, such symbolism was dangerous. The church sought to suppress not just paganism, but autonomy, especially that of women. The Volur, who once guided tribes through prophecy and healing, were systematically erased. Their staffs, found buried beside their skeletons in graves across Scandinavia, became evidence of witchcraft. Their knowledge of herbs, childbirth, and ritual became forbidden lore. By the 13th century, even speaking of Freya could invite suspicion, yet the memory of her never died. Instead, it transformed into tales of the Huldra, the forest maiden who lured men away, or the Sedkona, the wise woman who knew too much. These legends were not born from fear of evil, but from guilt, the lingering memory of what was lost when faith turned to shame. When archaeologists in the 20th century began to piece together the remains of Viking temples and artifacts, they found traces of a faith far more complex than the one described by medieval chroniclers. The so-called sexual rituals were not depravity, they were metaphors for the union of nature and creation, offerings of beauty, dance, and symbolic gesture meant to invoke life's renewal. The horror, perhaps, lies not in the rituals themselves, but in what was done to erase them. Entire histories rewritten, names forbidden, symbols defaced, the sacred turned to sin. And yet, somehow, the story endured. In rural Sweden, there is a legend told every winter about the night of three fires. It says that on the coldest night of the year, if the earth is not honored, the frost will creep into the homes of men and take what warmth remains. To keep it away, people used to light three fires, one for life, one for death, and one for love. They did not know why, only that their ancestors demanded it. When historians traced this tale backward, they found echoes of the old Viking solstice rituals, ceremonies once devoted to Freya and Freyr, the twin deities of fertility and rebirth. The legend had survived for 1,000 years, stripped of its name, but not its heart. It is this persistence, this quiet defiance of memory, that defines the haunting legacy of the Vikings. They are remembered as raiders, but their true power lay in belief. They lived in a world where the divine was everywhere, in the soil beneath their feet, in the storms that broke their ships, in the fleeting warmth of human connection. To them, every act of passion or creation was not indulgence, it was worship. And perhaps that is what unsettles us even now. Because beneath our modern world of reason and restraint, we still carry the same hunger to touch something beyond ourselves, to feel that spark of the eternal. The Vikings simply had the courage to face it. It's strange, isn't it? How a people once feared for their brutality are now remembered for their art, their poetry, their craftsmanship. The same hands that swung axes carved stories into stone. The same voices that shouted in battle sang hymns to the dawn. History has a way of simplifying what it cannot understand. But if you listen closely to the wind that rolls over the northern seas, to the creak of ancient wood in Scandinavian forests, you might still hear their echo, a whisper reminding us that the line between devotion and desire, between reverence and fear, has always been thin. The rituals of the Viking Age were never truly about sin or pleasure. They were about connection to the gods, to the land, to one another. They were about finding meaning in the fragile beauty of existence. And though the world moved on, burying their faith beneath centuries of silence, their spirit remains in every rune, every song, every legend that refuses to die. If you've made it this far into the story, you already know history isn't just written in books, it's carved into us. It lives in our blood, in the stories we tell, to explain who we are and what we've lost. So if you haven't yet, join this journey, subscribe, and let's keep uncovering the forgotten truths that shaped humanity, not the sanitized myths, but the raw, haunting stories that still have the power to make us feel alive, because the past is never really gone. It sleeps beneath the snow, waiting for someone brave enough to dig it up.